Joining us now is Colonel Douglas McGregor to help us make sense out of the fog of propaganda from the Western press of what's happening in Bakhmut. Colonel, thank you for making time for us. If you just read Western media this weekend, you would think that, well, Ukraine has just retreated and they're going to encircle Russian forces and they don't really control. What is the truth? What is actually happening in Bakhmut, and what is the significance of it?
Well, listen, you're asking the right questions, and Americans need to know the answers. I think the first thing we need to keep in mind is that Bakhmut was probably the most successful trap ever created in military history. Ultimately, the Russians managed to turn Bakhmut into the graveyard of the Ukrainian army. At least 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed and many more were wounded. It has been nothing but a complete disaster. Zelensky obsessed over Bakhmut the way Hitler obsessed over Stalingrad. And the Ukrainians have had to pay a terrible price. And if you want to know just how profound the impact of this loss is, you need to look at Politico's article over the weekend about the desire of people in the White House inside the Biden administration to press for a so-called frozen conflict in Ukraine. I mean, it's abundantly clear to them that the myth of Ukrainian victory is just that. It's a myth. There's no chance whatsoever. In fact, the Ukrainians are on the road to total defeat and collapse. And what they've done is said, well, you know, we can't win, so we'll try to turn Ukraine into a European version of the Korean Peninsula. We'll split it. We'll freeze the conflict. We'll move U.S. forces into Western Ukraine, and then we'll just sit across from the Russians for another 50, 60, 70 years. Of course, this won't work, Charlie, because the Russians have no incentive to cooperate with that. The Russians are waiting for one more burst of energy out of the Ukrainians, which they will annihilate, another massive offensive that goes nowhere. And then I think they're going to move to take Odessa and Kharkov. But the truth is that Bakhmut was a catastrophe, and everyone knows it. People know the Ukrainians can't win. Now we're acting desperately at every turn. Send them F-16, send them whatever we have. Truth is, none of that's going to make any difference. The real danger in the future is that once it becomes clear that Ukraine has collapsed and the Russians are overrunning the two areas that I just mentioned, which are historically Russian, I fear that fools in Washington will talk about direct intervention by U.S., Polish, Romanian, maybe some British forces to somehow or another rescue the situation. That would put us at war with Russia, and we're not prepared for it.
I mean, that is definitely the disaster to be feared. And you read the Western media. I mean, you have it right here in the New York Times and all over the Wall Street Journal. You know, it says that Ukraine let this happen, and then they're trying to go back into Bakhmut. So, but let's talk more about this from an American perspective. I had a dialogue recently with a lawmaker who is very pro this war, and he's like, well, we have to fight to the bitter end for the liberation of Ukraine. And I said, well, how do you define Ukraine? He said, oh, including Crimea. I mean, can you just walk our audience through, Colonel, how irresponsible, how reckless that is? I don't think most Americans comprehend how cataclysmic some of their lawmakers are thinking on these topics.
Well, Washington is characterized by a unique combination of arrogance and ignorance. The people talking in Washington, the vast majority of them know absolutely nothing about Eastern Europe, let alone Russia and Ukraine. The problem is that in 2014, people that are now inside the administration were involved in staging essentially a coup and removing the government that had been elected and replacing it with a government of their choice.